Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome everybody this morning to DCU Helix for this very special event. I'd especially like to welcome our students from the Centre for Talented Youth, National Centre for Talented Youth, who are here with us for their summer school. So maybe we might put our hands up there so we can identify ourselves. So you're very welcome. My name is Dara Kyo. I'm a Deputy President of the University, and it's my honour to welcome you and to give you the usual health warnings. I'd ask you please to take notice of the nearest exit to you, and to remember that for some of you it may be behind you. And again, just to remind you please to put your phones on silent, but critically to ask you to tweet that your people back in the office will know that you're here when you tweet. So to tweet that you're here today, and the hashtag that we're using is DCU Lagarde Visit. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome on the stage at Dublin City University Madame Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and our host, Professor MacCraith, President of Dublin City University. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the very warm welcome for Madame Lagarde. I think she's we have just come from DCU Alpha, DCU's Innovation Campus, where Madame Lagarde got a small flavour of what we do as a dynamic, innovative university, and she got to meet a number of the high-tech companies there. In fact, it was difficult to get her away from the high-tech companies, such was her interest. Madame Lagarde, you're now on one of our 3 academic campuses where we have the privilege of educating over 17,000 students in this part of Dublin City. Before we begin our conversation, let me, on behalf of the university, extend to you a céad míle fáilte, a bienvenue to Dublin City University.
Merci.
You can see, Madame Lagarde, from the size of the audience, we've nearly 800 people here, and from the warmth of the applause, that your visit is warmly welcomed, and people are really dying to hear what you have to say, so I will keep my contributions to a minimum. So, to begin our conversation, I'm going to go back to the very beginning. Like me, both your parents were educators.
Yes.
So I would say your assignments were always done in time, and education was probably important in your household. So, my first question is, what role did education play in your life's journey, and who or what were the major early influences?
I think education played a major role in my life. Probably not to my knowledge in the early stages, because, you know, as I grew up like you in a house where there were lots of books, where there was lots of talking around the dinner table, and where my parents invited other professors and other people in the education world and have us participate in those moments, I thought that everything was like that, and that you know, growing in an environment with books, with knowledge, with a taste for you know, theatre, music, and all these things that make life more beautiful was just the way life was. So it wasn't a wealthy background by any chance, because professors, educators in those days were not highly paid, nor are they today for that matter.
You're already very popular here.
No, but look, you know, I'm not here to flatter or to put any particular point in respect of that community, which I highly respect. But in retrospect, and where I am now, I think that I was the wealthiest person on earth, because having access to that knowledge and growing up in that environment certainly enriched my brothers and I, and we didn't know about it. So it did play a role. Now, was I a good student? Good pupil to begin with, a good student later on? No. Did my parents despair of me? Yes, on occasions. And I have to confess one thing, it's not until the age of 17 that I was able to speak some decent foreign language. And my English was just appalling for a long period of time, which was a cause of great concern for my father, who was professor of English literature. So it was difficult.
Now, education is not solely about what happens in the lecture theatre or the classroom. I mean, it's much more about developing the rounded individual. And here at DCU, we place a very strong emphasis on extracurricular activities and arts, culture, sport, indeed. But I read that you were a member of the national French synchronized swimming team, which is an interesting fact about you. But my question was, did you find any challenge in balancing all of the activities and practicing and training for that with your academic? And secondly, what did you learn from being involved in such a disciplined sport?
Discipline. First of all, I learned humility as well as discipline. Because in those days, I'm going to say a few words about synchronized swimming because it's a fantastic sport and one that I have thoroughly enjoyed and learned a lot from. But in those days, synchronized swimming was not an Olympic sport, was regarded as a sort of a discounted category of sports by the swimmers, the water polo players, the divers, who thought that their particular category of sport was real sport. But those girls who were, dancing in water, who were swimming 50 meters underwater without breathing, and who were doing quite athletic things, were not actually athletes. So that's how you learn humility. And as the national coach used to say to us, it's when it gets tough, just grit your teeth and smile and get on with it. And that has continued to resonate with me because in the course of my life, not as an athlete, but as a person, as we all do, we face adversity, we face moments that are tough and where you think that you are undermined, your self-esteem is challenged and so on and so forth. And to actually remember to grit your teeth and smile and just get on with it and move forward is something that has helped me a great deal. But discipline, any sport is about practice, working hard, training, retraining, failing, making progress, failing again, making more progress, eventually succeeding. And that is common to all sports, however graded, ranked, rated they are. Sure. What is special about synchronized swimming, as many other team sports, is the team aspect of it. Yes. Because when you do 6 or 8 swimmers work, you rely on the other 5 or the other 7. And if one is not pulling her weight and is not helping, then you might be underwater for much more longer than you thought you would be or you should be. So it's
so good life lessons learned through the sporting activity.
Yes.
We've many young students in the audience, particularly as Dara mentioned from our Centre for Talented Youth. They're at the beginnings of their careers. Looking back to your teenage you as a synchronized swimmer and learning English, what advice would you give to them now from your perspective as one of the most influential and most important people in the world?
I would say take risk. Take risk. I think the first risk that I really took in my life was after my father passed away. I was 16 and I was the eldest in the family. And as it happened, I was selected for a scholarship called the American Field Service, but it's a scholarship where you go abroad, in those days in the United States, for 1 year, you stay away from the family, you have virtually no contact other than by post in those days. You were waiting for the letter to arrive, and it took 5 years for that letter to arrive. You had a shoestring budget to live on, but you were with a host family and a host school. And, the likelihood of me actually accepting that, taking the risk of moving away when the family was grieving and it was hard for all of us, I think was a first intelligent move, and I'm grateful to my mother for having encouraged and supported that. But I would say, yes, take risk. It might work, it might not work, but you're going to learn in the process, like you never learn later. I think it's at that time in our life when you just pick up, you absorb, you digest, and you enrich yourself. So I would say that first and foremost. And, no, one more thing. When you're through with your college years and particularly educational time, although I think education is a lifelong story, but that very intense education time, go for the stars. Don't undermine yourself, don't restrict your horizon, don't assume, as I did actually when I finished, studying law, studying political sciences and having graduated from good schools, I thought, well, I'll do some human resources work. That was a dumb thing to think in those days. And I was clearly, undermining myself, sort of looking at a smaller horizon. And it's only because I met a few people, and sometimes not necessarily the big role models that you have in mind. You can learn from all sorts of people who will then stimulate you and say, why on earth would you do human resources? You can do a lot more than that, a lot better than that, a lot different than this sort of patterned channel and carrier development that is associated with certain things that you have seen. Look at something bigger, even if more difficult. So those are the two things I would say. Take risks and look at the big picture and have. I was quoting Faulkner earlier on for you, and that's a quote that I like. It's, make sure you have big dreams so that you don't lose sight of them. I think that's an important one.
So ambition is very important, and as president of the university, I better say human resources are very important as well. So. Madame Lagarde, can we now turn to the subject of Europe? Now, Europe is at a crossroads, and through a range of consultative processes, it's considering its own future. And I know we've many Europeans in the audience. As a committed European yourself, would you care to share with us your views on the future of Europe?
That's a wake-up call to remind us that it's a big project that is at risk, and the future of which is at stake, actually. I think you learn from history, and we constantly have to remind ourselves, however we progress in life and whatever generation is thinking about those issues, that it all started with the ultimate desire to avoid war, to resolve issues by dialogue and cooperation, and to create an ambition that would be sort of bigger than each individual national pattern and strategy. So war seems so far-fetched for many of us in Europe because we have not lived through that, or we see it from a distance, however sad we can be about it and however much we want to do about it, but it's far away. It's not within our borders. It's not affecting our direct family members at the moment. So we have to just constantly remind ourselves that that was the original project. And I know it sounds a bit corny to talk about that, but I think it's really, really important because things can change in a very short span of time, as we see. And I would say that it is extremely important for the Europeans to stay as much together as they can, to deepen the integration of Europe and particularly the euro area, and to offer this alternative set of values, principles, constructions, dialogue to other models that exist somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Because I think that Europe is an enormous inspiration for other people, other countries. And for those of us who struggle with the day-to-day complexities, the laborious process through which we reinforce, we integrate, we respond better to external shocks, it's sometimes discouraging and frustrating. But I think we need to constantly have in mind where we're coming from, what was the aspirations of the founders, and where we can be and how we can inspire others in the world. Now, a lot is to be done. If you ask me on the pure financial side, which is what the IMF is working on, there's a lot that needs to be done. There is a lot that has been accomplished in the last 10 years, particularly after the crisis, but there's still a lot of work to do, while at the same time, the euro area, Europe, are under external shocks, whether it's the migration waves, whether it is the anti-trade approaches, whether it's the protectionism temptation, whether it's the internal response that is often based on more of a nationalist approach than a European community approach. But it's a cause that is worth spending time, energy, and effort on together.
Of course, and there are many features and factors in it. But here in Ireland, obviously, we are somewhat distracted from the broader issues and consumed or obsessed with all things Brexit, and perhaps as we should be. In fact, here at DCU, we've created a very active Brexit Institute that's trying to actually contribute to the thinking around the topic. But I'm sure the audience would be very interested to hear your perspectives on Brexit and its various implications, Madam Lagarde.
You know, what has been decided, so I'm not going to comment on that. And I think at the IMF, we have, at the time, we have made some baseline scenarios which proved to be actually the reality of what happened. We had some downside scenario which were a little bit more pessimistic, which most of our opposition refers to, but actually the forecast we had on our baseline scenario was actually what happened. Where the energy and the brain power and the innovation needs to focus now is how to minimize the negative aspects of this decision on both sides, for the European Union, for the 27, and of course for the UK as well. And I'm glad that you are focusing on that and that the Institute has a Brexit particular research center, because I think it is affecting so many layers of our societies, the economic organizations, the various sectors of activity. And I hear very often my colleague and friend Barnier say that 750 agreements have to be renegotiated and reframed and reorganized. It's that, but it's lots of impact as well at the microeconomic level too, where so many companies have organized themselves using the supply chain that incorporated the UK, for instance. And that has to be disentangled to a certain extent, I suppose, because of all sorts of barriers, and whether tariffs or non-tariff barriers, that are going to impact on the free movement of goods, services, and people. Now, clearly, the objective, I would hope, is to facilitate the continuation of movements that have benefited quite a lot the people on both sides.
So we'll watch with interest. But you alluded there to some of the international trade tensions. Now we've many people from the business sector here in the audience, and I know it's a burning issue for them in terms of the threats of a trade war, the tit-for-tat tariffs. We heard about Harley-Davidson overnight, and things are changing in a very chaotic fashion. And if I may quote you from the recent G7 summit, you warned about, and I quote directly here, clouds accumulating on the horizon of the global economy, getting darker by the day. So it's fairly ominous. So how are you reading the situation now?
Well, it's in a way, it's quite a frustrating moment because we've been through 10 years of re-architecturing, reinforcing the system, making sure that banking and finance is not going to be a threat and will not create the circumstances that we had in 2008. And we are coming to the end of that process. And we currently have, on a global basis, a growth of our entire economy, which is pretty much on a par with what we had before the crisis. So most European companies have restored their position, not all of them. Some of them have suffered massively and need to still fill the gap and improve. But many of the economies of the world have significantly improved. The forecast for economic growth this year is 3.9%. It was 4% on average in the years before the financial crisis, so we're pretty much in the same place. And forecast for next year is 3.9% as well, provided things go in the right direction and short of massive change of policies. So we are, in a way, economically in a reasonably good place. And growth is generated pretty much around the world. Out of the 189 countries that we have in the membership, about 40 only are not growing on a per capita basis. So it's well sourced around the world. And it's a time when we would hope that it continues to thrive and policymakers and people can actually concentrate on the long-term issues, such as the issue of climate change, such as the issue of excessive inequalities, such as the issue of excessive debt burden, both at the sovereign and at the corporate level. So you have three buckets of risks that you can really address together with some structural reforms to improve flexibility, fluidity of factors, agility, and the transformation of our society through good use of technologies. Those would be really challenging projects to work on, but that needs to be fueled by growth, because growth makes it easier. When you want to reduce excessive inequalities, you can distribute better. If you want to reduce your debt burden, you have a fiscal policy that is facilitated by growth, and on and on.
But is it
and
all...
we know
Yeah.
that growth, I'll just finish the reasoning. We know that growth is fueled, to simplify excessively, but it's a combination of consumption, investment, and trade. And what we're seeing now is finally, after 10 years of international trade growing more slowly than overall growth, we finally see a return to international trade actually outpacing growth, which means that it is a positive contributor to growth. So now is not, and we also know from research that we do that the intersection between trade and investment is very significant. And so is improved productivity, because by opening trade and opening to competition, you encourage improved productivity. All those factors contribute to growth. If you start undermining international trade by putting in place barriers, quotas, non-tariff barriers, and bringing that level of uncertainty with which companies suddenly say, well, I'm not sure that I want to invest in that particular country. I'm not sure that I want to beef up my factory in that place. I'm not sure that I want to file my intellectual property in such country because I just don't know where this is heading. That is particularly frustrating for those of us who have worked hard to improve the system and who hope that on climate change, on excessive inequality, on excessive debt, on productivity, on use of technology, we can make progress. So that's why we are concerned.
Thank you, and that's a very comprehensive answer. In the middle of that answer, you talked about technology. Technology and of course, technology and data are very relevant to many in the audience, particularly at this university and our students. And just to give you a context, the largest research centre in Europe on data analytics, this is one of the major nodes of that, and that's been very important in terms of our economic recovery and foreign direct investment and so on. But you gave an interesting quote a few weeks back, which is that the future of trade is the future of data.
Yep.
And this clearly has many implications for regulation, national, international economic policies and skills development and so on. I'm sure our audience would be really interested to get your take on this, because it's a multifaceted, multi-intersectional issue. And so please let us know your thinking on this.
Well, if you look at the balance of trade, you look at one aspect of things. If you take all the components of exchanges between countries, it's not going to be just about the goods that move from one country to the other and that pass a border. It's also going to be about the services.
Yes.
And what we are seeing clearly is a far higher and stronger growth in the trade of services than in the trading of goods. And it might be a bit far-fetched, and we'll see what the future has to offer. But if you really project yourself into the future, it might well be that the movement of goods will significantly reduce because there will be much more onshoring or backshoring as a result of 3D printings, artificial intelligence use, data mining, and all the rest of it, which, if combined, could actually localize production rather than take advantage of cheap factors of production elsewhere. So what we are seeing growing fast is the trade in services. And when you then go down into what are those services, they are predominantly now driven by digital, by the use of data, by the accumulation of data, maybe the sharing of data. And I think that's, that's what we are seeing, and that's where the trends are going, which is why, I was saying, you quoted me, that trade of the future will be e-trade, will be service trade, will be based and driven by data and what we do with data, which raises a whole host of other issues.
Yes. And of course, the issue of the citizen in all of this is critically important. So data and the citizen, and it's a topic that's of really significant interest to Ireland now, with so many of the major tech companies, GDPR, and recent developments in the US. So it's, do you want to comment on this?
Well, I think that, sort of off the cuff, it raises two categories of issues which are clearly important. I would say three. One is the issue of privacy. How do you own, license, protect, consent? It's the whole gamut of this data that you're using is mine. Why, how, under what terms do I give it away? Do I consent? Do I get a consideration for that under good English contractual law? How do I control the ultimate use of those data, as we saw recently with the recent scandal that didn't take place in Ireland? It was more the UK, right? Yeah.
Cambridge Analytics.
Yeah. I didn't want to mention anybody, but I guess.
I said it softly. It's okay.
But they filed for bankruptcy now, so it's probably water under the bridge.
Madam Lagarde, I'm going to move on to another topic because...
No, because there's I want to mention the other two things that I think are really of concern. The second one, which I think is going to open up a field of research, and I don't know whether DCU would participate in that, but it's really important. How do we apply competition law and the whole rules that have been elaborated over the course of time in relation to goods that have been slightly tweaked at the margin as we were moving into some intangible through the use of software licenses and things like that, for instance. But how do you apply competition law concept to this issue of accumulation, aggregation, and ownership of data?
Yes.
Who is in a dominant position? Who has such a market position that it can actually give rise to abuses? What are the concerted practices between entities in that respect? I think there will have to be new definitions of those concepts that have evolved over time, and that needs to be re-examined. And the third point I would mention is the issue of it's more than access; it's education. It's if data is the trade of the future, I think somebody was quoted to say that data was oil of the future, because it will fuel and move information around our economies. How do we not manipulate at all, but how do we access them? How do we play with them? How do we get adjusted to that?
And avoid a social divide.
Correct. And what is the educational system over what period of time in your life? How do you get this constant upskilling that is necessary?
This is something of huge interest to us here, and focusing on that lifelong learning piece, particularly around the digital skills, and we're reforming curricula here to address that. I'm conscious of time and so many important topics, and the next one is one that's very keenly associated with you, and that's the area of gender equality. And like you, Madam Lagarde, this university places a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And just last week we launched a new Centre of Excellence for Diversity and Inclusion, and we awarded an honorary doctorate to the first elected female leader of a parliament in the Arab world, Dr. Amal Al-Kubaisi. I'm not sure if you've met her, but a very impressive lady. And indeed today is National Diversity and Inclusion Day here. So, Madame Lagarde, in a male-dominated world, you have flourished and risen to the very top. And I know for the women in the audience, probably for everybody, but many will be intrigued to know about the particular challenges you faced and how you overcame them to reach those dizzy heights.
Again, I go back to childhood. I think I was blessed and privileged because of the background that our parents gave us and the confidence that they inspired because they trusted us. I think a lot of things actually develop in the course of your life as a result of energy level and confidence. And those are things that you can actually share, that you can entrust to somebody else. And I was lucky to have received a good dose of both. But it needs constant refueling. Confidence is something which is precious, which you know you cherish and you give back, or you give as simply as that. So I guess I had this privilege of the initial base on which I continued to build and develop and give to others as well. I don't think that there is any secret or any mystery. I think that the best way to gain confidence is to love and to be loved, and I very strongly believe that can come from parents, from brothers and sisters, from husbands, wives, companions, mates, and any people. So I think it's also an issue of attitude, and it's also about having enough of a confidence in yourself so that you can distance yourself on occasions from the nasty comments, from the discriminating attitude, from the contempt that people sometimes hold you in. And having a bit of a sense of humor actually helps a great deal. And you know, it's difficult when you are a student. It's difficult when you get your first job and you are, you know, the sort of junior associate, and when you've got lots of senior guys generally, not that many gals, unfortunately, despite efforts of good universities like yours. But hopefully this will change. But you need to forge alliances. You need to identify in the organization where you join, where you want to prosper and challenge yourself. You need to find people who are going to support you. They don't have to be females, for those of you who are concerned, and legitimately so, about the gender gap. They can be males. I have received the support of a couple of one extraordinary and one very decent male partners in Baker McKenzie, where I started my professional life. And one of them was, you have to remember, I'm not a spring chicken anymore. So in those days, you know, the first interview that I had with a very, very reputed and good law firm was horrifying, because I was told right from the get-go that you know, I had no chance of ever becoming a partner. And when I asked why, they said, you know, with a big smile, because you're a woman. So those were the days. It was actually said. Now I don't think it is said anymore, but it sometimes happens. So I was lucky at Baker McKenzie that the lead partner had been educated, brought up by a very strong and determined mother, and he believed in the power of women. So he supported young female associates in the firm, and he gave us a hand, and he was certainly both a mentor and a very supportive one, as was another female partner in the firm who also helped out without ever conceding or compromising on the excellence and the quality work that she expected from us. But she also recognized that there were discriminating moments, that there was gender gaps, and that there were things that had to be addressed. So try to find those alliances, those friends, those colleagues, those people who will see value in you, even though you're different from them, gender or otherwise, or if you come from a different university, or if you have different sexual preferences, and so on and so forth. Alliances actually will make you stronger, and you can give to them as much as they will give to you. Because, as I said, confidence and level of energy are key to actually move forward, together with a good dose of humor.
I think they're really important messages, and thank you for those. You've talked a little bit about the global economic outlook earlier on, so I'm going to skip past that and really move on to something of closer to home for members of the audience, and that's the Irish context. All indicators, including the IMF outlook for Ireland, are all very positive, and as you said yourself yesterday, that the sun is shining on the Irish economy for now. So what have we done right to achieve this remarkable turnabout? And obviously in asking you that, I'm coming to the other half of the question, but so what have we done right?
I think the first thing that was, it started off from a really difficult situation, let's face it, where, prior to 2008, many countries had ignored a few signals, a few warnings, and the banking sector in particular had really overstretched massively and taken massive risks. And the handling of that situation was in the realm of the unknown. So there was a lot of experimentation that was painful and difficult. I think what distinguishes Ireland from other European countries that have faced similar situation is the resilience, the determination, the decisiveness, and the ownership. And I pay tribute to the leadership of Ireland in those days, from Prime Minister to central bank governor to finance ministers, of course. They knew that they had to grit their teeth, smile and get on with it, and that there would be some hard decisions, hard measures that had to be applied in order to restore the position of the Irish economy. But that was done with the sense, I'm giving you my perception from the outside. You might have a completely different perception. But the sense was that everybody had to make an effort, that it was the only way to regain sovereignty, autonomy, and independence of decisions and judgment, and to come back to a position where jobs would be on offer and where the economy would bounce back. And it happened in very short order, if you look at it. Sure. So I think applying some of the basic recipes, and of course certain things could have been done better, as it always is the case. But I think that the very distinguishing factor was this resilience, decisiveness, ownership, and leadership that permeated the entire economic measures that were taken at the time.
And what about the vulnerabilities now, Madame Lagarde? I mean, there's a lot of risk.
Well, one is, I think the Irish economy finds itself with attractiveness that has precipitated a movement of intellectual property or other intangible to Ireland, which have propelled the growth of Ireland to levels that are just not seen in advanced economies those days. If the Irish economy was growing at 7.8% in 2017, there's a good chunk of it that is real economic development, and which is probably at the highest within the euro area. But there is a chunk of that which has to do with optimization of localization of intellectual property around the world coming to Ireland. So that's one. And it's not going to be necessarily recurrent forever, yes. Number one. Number two, there is clearly a movement towards tax harmonization, tax-based definition, and so on and so forth, which will erode probably in the medium to long term that attractiveness, which is quite specific to Ireland. I would say, second, that because of this economic developments that you've had in the last 3 years or so, clearly the housing sector is one that is that is short of the demand, and as a result of that, the cost of housing is high. There's not enough supply of housing on the markets, and that is an issue that I know the authorities want to continue to address. And I saw the Taoiseach yesterday, and we talked about that. And this is clearly an area where we at the IMF are suggesting that more be actioned. And because of the measures that had to be taken, public investment will be needed in various sectors. Mm-hmm. I think the health sector is one that warrants maybe a better degree of efficiency and reorganization, and maybe some better directed funding. And education is certainly one where I would be remiss if I did not mention that additional public spending on research, for instance, would be a good idea. Yes, that's true.
Which amazingly leads me so neatly into my next question. You talk, I think many people would recognize this, about the precarious nature of the future of the taxation base. In the view of many, Ireland's future prosperity and resilience will depend on two things, really: the fostering of talent and the creation of a dynamic innovation ecosystem. And of course, they're linked. In that context, I'd like you to say maybe a little bit more about the investment in education and research, because really after the austerity, particularly in the higher education area, it's well established through many government reports, we've not kept pace with our competitors. And surely this is a future that is not sustainable for an economy, a knowledge-based economy such as ours.
No, that's absolutely right. And, I think that the education, the definition and the future of education is not in infancy, because it's as long as humanity, but I think that the external shocks that our economies are bearing also apply to education, and the speed at which innovation impacts our economies requires that education be thought through in a slightly different ways from what we have seen for many decades. It was all very well for several decades to work in a particular field, to specialize in a particular area, and then to access the labor market with a particular profession or with a particular skill set. I think those days are probably gone and need to be transformed into a different system of education, which will require funding, which will require financing, and which will be probably much more about a lifelong cycle of education.
Yes.
How that is organized, whether it's through intensive periods over the course of life, or whether it's sort of drip, drip, drip throughout life without particular sequences, I don't know. What particular fields of education will have to be developed? Will it be a combination of computer sciences plus one or two new areas? Will it be predominantly sciences plus some soft skills which will have to come together, because agility, the ability to adjust and to understand and to sense developments and relationships also will be critical? Is something that I believe the education community has to help all of us explore and improve over the course of the months and years to come, because I think there is urgency in that respect. We cannot possibly continue to produce the same graduates, the same PhDs as we did 40 years ago. And that applies, by the way, to all institutions. It applies to the IMF as well. Sure. And we have teams of our staff actually focusing on that and asking themselves, do we need to continue to hire the typical macroeconomic PhDs of the old days? Do we need to continue doing the audit of an economy in the same old ways as we did 40 years ago? What can we change about the way in which we identify data, in which we collect statistics, in which we provide analytical work to the scientific community, but also to the general public, so that instead of being regarded as the experts or the elite, we actually share and provide in layman and woman terms the fruit of authentic and honest research.
Indeed, and I know that in our own deliberations, the role of the humanities and social sciences are actually more increasingly recognised as having a relevance for society today. Now, our conversation is very interesting, but I'm conscious that...
By the way, I think, on the issue of financing, we need to have an open mind, because it cannot only be about public finance.
Sure.
Because the fiscal position of many countries is quite constrained at the moment, and they need to be careful to accumulate some buffers for when the next crisis hits and comes. So to the extent that we regard education as a lifelong cycle, which benefit the individual, but also the companies or the institutes or the public service, where individuals contribute and accomplish their talent. Those institutions, those companies, those services have to participate in the funding as well. And we are seeing developments in the making.
This is a live debate here as well.
Yeah.
I know many came today to get an opportunity to ask their own questions of Madame Lagarde. So we have our Helix volunteers in their maroon uniforms with microphones on both sides of the auditorium. I'm conscious that with so many people wanting to make questions and with limited time, we're going to group questions together. So can I ask you to keep your questions short and please avoid filibusters? And if you could state your name and identify your affiliation if you have one, and I'll try and gather the questions together, and Madame Lagarde will take some notes and hope to get to as many questions as possible. She has a very busy schedule, and we have to let her go quite sharply around 12:30. So can I start with question number 1 here, please, in the front row?
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Merci.
My name is Jerry Ellis. I'm with Bank of Ireland, but I'm also blind and have been involved with accessibility for people with disabilities for over 30 years, having spoken in conferences on over 35 countries. The big question that's always thrown with us as people with disabilities to avoid our inclusion is cost. Would you be able to address the question on this Diversity and Inclusion Day of other reasons for including people with disabilities and other diverse groupings, other than just saying, no, it costs too much? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you. Merci.
I'll take one more. There's one more over here on the extreme right.
Thank you. Ian Cooper of the DCU Brexit Institute. My question is, when you were chosen, that was a great milestone for diversity, but the IMF is a global institution, and there's an unwritten rule that the managing director is always a European. When the time comes to choose the next managing director, would you support the idea of a non-European?
Okay.
Getting very tricky. There's one more over here. Sorry, there's one here, sorry. Can I take from the lady first and then I'll come to you, if that's okay?
My name is Martin Walsh, and I've had a career in finance, particularly housing. Now, you mentioned the housing and the cost of housing as an issue here. Now, it's such a huge driver of prices. The supply of housing has huge consequences for the Irish economy. And it's not just the supply of the construction. We have an enormous problem on zoning. You have resistance from existing residents, and we have had a huge relationship between politics and zoning. And I have often felt that this was such an important issue in the Irish economy, that zoning and those sort of issues should have the independence equivalent to the central bank oversight, but out of the day-to-day hands of politicians, which has a whole range of awkward complexities, shall we put it like that.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, Madame Lagarde, there's 3 there.
Okay.
First on diversity from Jerry, then Ian was talking about the future appointments in the IMF, and then Martin talking about some of the local housing issues in Ireland. So over to you.
Yeah, on the issue of accessibility for those disabled for any reason, any particular reason, blindness or otherwise, I personally think that this is an obligation of society. And if I look at what has happened in my own country, in France, it is when President Chirac decided that disability was a national cause and had several laws voted to actually require that public service, that companies have to pay for the access, the environment, the workplace, the tools, in order to facilitate the work or the moving of disabled people, that actually things began to happen. And the law was particularly strict in that if the measures were not taken by companies, by municipalities for access facilitation and minimum required employed with disabilities, then the companies or the municipalities had to pay fines and penalties, which very often were enough of a deterrent so that companies that did not understand, or municipalities that did not understand that diversity arising from different people working together was not enough of a benefit, would actually understand the lesson by having to pay the penalty. So I think that's an area where, I'm not a great proponent of state interventions in any and all respects, but I think in that respect it was helpful, and it's a necessity. You asked me if when I stopped being the managing director, I would support another non-European or European. That presupposes that I don't die on the job. So, but joke aside, I think that it would be really good to have whoever is the managing director of that institution that I care so much for be selected exclusively on his or her merits, preferably her. Now, zoning and housing and politics, that is the world over. And I don't know whether there is a good solution to that. I completely agree with you that too much politics inserted into zoning is just bad news, delay, poor ultimate choice, and lack time of all sorts, but equally not having the community represented at a certain level to a certain degree when choosing whether a place is going to remain a park or will have high-rise buildings or will be office space rather than retail, rather than residential. This is a very subtle mixture of both that needs to take place. Now, how you maintain the perfect integrity of that system is really at stake. I agree with you.
Thank you,
What
Madam.
I've heard from authorities, though, is that housing, they all understand, is an issue that needs to continue to be addressed. There are efforts, as we know, for reviewing the economy of Ireland. There are efforts, there is progress, but we think that this should be continued.
Now, thank you, Madam Lagarde. There was a question over here, young lady.
Hello, Madame Lagarde. Deirdre Mortel. I'm CEO of Social Innovation Fund Ireland. Europe has produced a wide range of initiatives and leading initiatives, I think, around social innovation in relation to solving the critical social and environmental issues across Europe. Ireland has been somewhat slow to come to the table in that, and I'm just wondering if you have a view on what the ideal role is for member states to take in relation to social innovation and the interaction between the European Union and member states on that.
Thank you, Deirdre. There's a gentleman here in the middle of the flat row. It's difficult to see people on the sloped area, so if you could wave at me. Yes, I see some now. Okay. And I'm trying to get a diversity of questioners in terms of gender and other ways as well. So can I start with this lady and then go to yourself with the beard in the middle, please? And then I'm going back up the sloped area, please.
Thank you. You mentioned confidence and the impact of confidence.
Identify yourself, please. Sorry.
My name is Kieran DeBush. I'm with Women for Election. You mentioned confidence and the impact of confidence on career progression, particularly for women in male-dominated areas. And as I mentioned, I'm with Women for Election, and we train women who are interested in politics, another very male-dominated area. And one of the key aspects of the training is around confidence and improving women's confidence. Have you any suggestions or ideas as to what else can be done to move women forward within politics and to ensure that we have a much greater equal representation within the political system?
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The gentleman with the beard, just be not too far away from you, please. Yeah, thank you. And we'll group those three questions when you're finished and go back to Madame Lagarde.
Hi, my name is Rob Galanders. I'm an assistant professor of economics in the business school here. I very much enjoyed your recent Guardian piece on the importance of trust and corruption the world over in many different spheres, primarily because it runs to my own research interests. I was wondering if you had any brief comments on how corruption makes the job of the IMF more difficult. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Now, Madame Lagarde. 3 there from Deirdre, from Kieran, and from Robert.
You know, the question you had on social innovation, I'm a little bit torn on that one, because I think that for innovation to prosper, particularly in a slightly different business model, so to speak, it might be well not to have too much state interference, not to have too much categories within which you check the box and you are regarded as social innovator leading to social entrepreneurship. So at the same time, if you are outside those categories or outside those inventories of talent, you might miss out on subsidies, on programs, on access to certain things that can actually facilitate innovation. I'm not sure, and I confess ignorance on that one. I don't know whether at the European level there is actually directives, regulations, categories of activities under the label of social innovation. So that I don't know. And I don't know what is the best option, to have that pretty much locked in and having the benefit of support, or a bit more free fall all and freer to innovate. What I know is that social entrepreneurship is growing and is certainly absorbing a lot of young talents that are seeing that as far more fulfilling as far as their personal objectives are concerned, as well as rewarding because it creates activities and it develops value. So,
and you met our Enactus social entrepreneurship students
yes,
earlier on.
And they're going to compete in the World Cup.
That's correct.
At the end of the year in the Silicon Valley,
correct,
against 36 other countries in that particular field. And I wish them the best of luck, really. Although they're competing against France as well. So. Now, I have 2 more questions. Suggestion for confidence and to move forward and to have better representation. I will say point blank that quotas actually make a difference. Sorry to say that, for many years in my life I thought that quotas were offensive and that women should be selected and should move based on their own merits, but it's taking too long. It's taking way too long. And I have seen the impact. So I'm okay, we swallow our pride, but we get the quotas. And I've seen it working. In my home country, there was a decision to actually institute quotas, not at the National Assembly, not at the Senate level, but at the municipal level, so that all lists would have 50% men, 50% women, and not the top 50 candidates male and the bottom 50 candidates female. 1, 1, 1, 1. So there was really a fair, and it was a level playing field for women, and lists had to comprise men and women in equal quantities, absent which there were significant penalties. Now, some political parties decided to go for the penalty and didn't want to comply with that, but many others didn't want to pay the penalty and went for the system. As a result of which, not only did municipalities show a different profile, but the Senate in France has a much, much higher proportion of women than the National Assembly, because the senators are elected at a particular type of election that comprises the group of mayors and municipally elected people as the voters. So indirectly, those quotas at the municipal level actually propelled many women in the Senate, which has a far better representation. The same applies to board composition, the same applies to executive teams. Quotas are a necessity. The last question I have to address is the one on corruption and trust. Corruption, I think it has been demonstrated by many, many others, academics and otherwise, is actually undermining economic growth, it's undermining the confidence in the system, it's moving talents away from the place where corruption prospers. Added to which, corruption facilitates the providing of false information, wrong numbers. And the work that we do with countries is based on integrity of data, is based on statistics that are produced, we hope, in good faith. When that is not the case, then it brings a degree of error and omission, obviously, in the work that we do. There have been many programs recently where we found out inadvertently, and sometimes through social media and civil societies, that certain aspects of an economy had been hidden from us, and that special purpose vehicles had been put aside outside the normal budget process. And when that happens, then we just stop supporting a country. And we say, unless and until this has come out in transparency, in the light of day, we're not going to continue to help you. Those examples are now public, and it has forced some of those countries to actually come clean, admit, and commit to operate in a proper way. But it's a big issue. It's a big issue, and one where we're going to show a stronger degree of scrutiny and involvement in order to identify it.
Thank you, Madam Lagarde. I think it's appropriate to take the very final question. The red light is flashing at me here in all sorts of funny ways. I'd love to take a final question from the Centre for Talented Youth students that are with us. If we could take one question there, please, if you don't mind. I know there's some disappointed people, but Madame Lagarde does have to move on. So if you could take one from the students there for Madame Lagarde. I thought I saw one waving.
My name is Patrick Flynn. I'm studying international relations in C2I. I'm just wondering, do you think it's morally correct to charge interest on loans as the managing director of the IMF for developing countries?
No, it's not, and that's the reason we charge zero interest. The loans that we give to low-income countries are always at zero interest rate. And that is, something that we have negotiated with the membership. You have to appreciate that the membership is 189 countries, and some of them, are lending their own financing, because that's the way the IMF works. It's like, community funding that is made available to members of the community. And some of them that do not have much actually would not mind if some interest was charged for those that are borrowing from them. But, and that is the case for those advanced economies or those middle-income countries, but for the low-income countries, zero interest.
Thank you, Madame Lagarde. We now finally have reached the time where we must let Madame Lagarde go. I think it's been a fantastic morning, and we're very grateful to you, Madame Lagarde.
You wanted to ask me for a quote.
I'm coming to this. You're not getting away lightly. We're very grateful for your insightful answers and for your engagement. Yesterday, you gave a very important speech at the Euro at 20 conference, and you quoted from Maria Edgeworth, from JFK, and from a number of Irish literary giants. Perhaps you might leave us with your favourite quotation that might be most appropriate for Ireland and for education and for our future.
Okay, it's not a very, we had staged and planned that, so that's the reason I was,
It was so smooth.
No, but that's the truth. So it's, I wanted to find something that was associated with the cheerfulness, the good spirit, the energy, and the warmth of Ireland as I have experienced it in my life. And then I scratched my head, and I've given you a couple of quotes, actually. One which is, grit your teeth and smile, which is one that I have gone by myself. Make sure that you have big dreams so that you don't lose sight of them is another one. But the one that I would actually resort to, and it's not necessarily the most poetical, although it was written by a poet who borrowed from another poet, and I will leave it to you to decide who it is. But the combination of quotes is the following, and I mentioned that yesterday actually. In dreams begin responsibilities, for you to decide who it is. But then, as part of that same poem, which was actually a song, it continues with, "Don't let the bastards get you down."
Ladies and gentlemen, I wish all Breen's questions were staged and planned. I can feel the frustration in the room, the frustration of people who had questions to ask, and Twitter was alive with lots of quotable quotes. We've had a wonderful, really wonderful morning here and a very kind of intimate conversation with Madame Lagarde, and we're very proud as a university community and very honoured that you visit us today, and especially that you have touched on so many areas that we value and cherish in the university: opportunity, lifelong learning, diversity, inclusion, opportunity, dreams, and above all, responsibilities. So on behalf of our, the great masses, Madame, can I thank you very much for being with us, and to thank the President for leading our thoughts today. So, Gur Míle Maith Agaibh.